Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. And thanks to Dean Spangler for the opportunity to speak with this group today. This is actually my first live presentation since the pandemic. And it was compelling for me to come and speak at this event because I've been doing work on school leadership for over 20 years. And one of the key themes of that work is that it takes a village. I mean, getting good school leaders is a system-wide proposition. And so the fact that today we have in this room representatives from the State Department of Education, the State Professional Standards Board, representatives from districts, practitioners, folks who prepare teachers and leaders, it really meant a lot to me, and I appreciate the opportunity to be able to share with you some insights from the work that I've done over the years. As my bio suggests, I got into education policy research because I was already doing work on talent management in other settings. And so somebody said, oh, could you come and help us analyze data on school leader careers and whatever? I said, oh, sure. And that kind of pulled me in, and I stayed, and I've continued to do work on school leadership since that time. And, you know, one of the themes that's come throughout this, this conference today is that this isn't a new challenge, right? When I was first examining principal career paths in 2000, it was a state of crisis. I was on a panel, nobody wants this job, because there were all these pressures now that school leaders were expected to be instructional leaders. They hadn't been prepared to do that. So, you know, and over time we've seen a shifting dialogue about why people don't want to do the job, but there always has been this concern. And I hope that, you know, we'll be able to talk about what some of the solutions are. And I think we have made a lot of progress in terms of doing better with things. So since I started doing this work back in the early 2000s, the other opportunity that I've had is to become a parent. I have two children who ended up attending a Title I elementary school. And in the span of 10 years, that school had 6 principals. So I got to experience what it's like to have a high level of principal turnover as a parent. I had the opportunity to be the parent representative on hiring panels. And then I also had the opportunity as a researcher to be involved with these initiatives sponsored by the Wallace Foundation, which were focused on both districts and principal preparation programs, also engaging strongly with states to promote a cohesive approach to addressing the challenges with school leadership. And so in my remarks today, I'd like to just provide some insights about what I think we've learned as a field over the years and what that might mean for the challenges that we are facing today. So I want to start by talking about an issue that I know is keeping a lot of you up at night as we enter this third full school year since the start of the pandemic, and that's the issue of principal turnover. And it's important to emphasize that turnover happens for a combination of personal, organizational, and performance-related reasons. And we worry about it because it could signal that schools won't have good principals. And frankly, because it's disruptive to the school community when it happens too often. I mean, I certainly experienced that as a parent. I'm sure the teachers in this room have experienced that as teachers. You know, while some degree of turnover is to be expected when it happens a lot, it's disruptive. And it's principal turnover is often talked about as an unequivocally bad thing, but it's something that you want to prevent or avoid. But in reality, it's a fact of life. And there are different reasons why it may happen with different implications. And so I want you just to consider two very different scenarios. Okay, so in the first scenario, there's an amazing high school principal, and that individual is promoted to become a principal supervisor in the district. In that role, they'll be supervising all of the secondary and middle school principals in the district, including the highly regarded assistant principal from that high school who's been selected to fill their shoes. So I want to ask, how many of you would be concerned about this school going into the next year? Would you be nervous about the quality of the school leadership? Probably not. You give that person a chance, right? Okay. Now consider another scenario. So after working 70 or more hours a week for the past 3 years, managing staffing shortages, including a vacant assistant principal position, and being harassed by parents and community members over COVID-19 policies, a burned out principal who's eligible for retirement files their retirement papers the day before the end of the school year. The district, which already had 2 principal openings that they were engaged in searches for, is going to scramble to fill that position. What would you think about that instance of principal turnover? Are you feeling good about that school for next year? No. So these two, disparate examples just show the range of things that might be in play when we're talking about principal turnover. I mean, I'll be reporting some numbers like what percentage of principals turn over, but that number reflects a combination of things. Some are choices that districts are making, some are choices that individuals are making, some things, just happen. One of the instances that I described as a principal who passed away, there's no way we can control those kinds of things. So it's important to understand all the things that go into the turnover as we think about how we manage it for the benefit of students. The reason that it's important, though, to think about how we manage it and to make sure that we manage it effectively is because research highlights that school leadership is important. School leadership is associated with better student outcomes, and research also suggests that good school leadership can reduce teacher turnover. We've been talking all morning about the teacher shortage and about how we create environments where teachers really want to work. When teachers wake up in the morning and they get in the car to show up at school, the principal is the first line manager who's interacting with them, supporting them, and creating the environment in which they work. So focusing on high-quality principals and ensuring that every school will have a high-quality principal does double duty in terms of also creating a better environment for teachers and ultimately improving teacher recruitment and retention. So in this presentation, I want to share with you some information about past trends in principal turnover, as well as findings from a recent survey done by some colleagues at RAND that speaks to the extent to which principal turnover is a problem today. Then I'll talk briefly about what goes into preparing and supporting and retaining good principals. Finally, I'll share with you some insights about how we can do a better job with that hiring, retention, and support from research that I've been involved in with initiatives focused on what districts can do and also what university preparation programs can do. So I'll start with some remarks about whether we should be worried about principal turnover. So this slide shows data from the most recent federal survey on school principals, the Schools and Staffing Survey. Unfortunately, it's a little bit old, but it's the best we have. And what this chart shows is that principal turnover generally, historically, tends to be in the 20% per year range. That means that in a typical year, 1 in 5 principals do not return to their schools between 1 year and the next. The most recent national survey data is from 2016-2017, and in that year, 82% of principals remained in place from that year to the following year. But that means that 18% did not. 16% of those were principals who switched schools, and only 10% actually left the principalship. Okay? So that just gives you a sense of historically, pre-pandemic, like, you know, what are we dealing with here? Now, if we look specifically at those principals who leave the principalship, what we see is that only 8% of them left for a job outside of education. The rest, in roughly equal proportions, made transitions that could be interpreted as promotions. So yeah, there I'm looking at those who say that they're still working in K-12 education, but just not in a school level position. So this could be like the example I gave about the principal being promoted to a principal supervisor. This could be somebody becoming a superintendent or some other central office position. Another roughly 1/3 made transitions that could be interpreted as reflecting that they were not a good fit for the job of the principal. Those are the principals who reported that they were working in a school level job but not a principal. They may have gone back to teaching. They may have moved into an assistant principal role. Those are some examples. And then, of course, about 1/3 retired, which is also to be expected. Unfortunately, those data are old, and we'd like to understand a little bit more about what's happening today. And so to do that, I want to share with you some findings from a recent survey that has been done by my colleagues, Elizabeth Steiner and C. Doan, and others at RAND. Their survey of school principals was part of something called RAND's American Educator Panel. This is a panel survey that reaches out to teachers, principals, and district officials on a regular basis. So that's basically a panel, we go back to them time and time again. And during the pandemic, the American Educator Panel team has been using this resource to kind of take the pulse of educators across the country on key important issues. And fortunately for us, they asked some questions about working conditions and also about intentions to stay in the profession. So I'll be sharing some of those findings with you here. So, echoing what we've already heard, on the teacher side, the survey shows that principals, as well as teachers, are stressed out. To orient you to this chart, the green bars show teacher responses. The blue bars in the middle show principal responses, and the gray bars show responses from a sample of working adults generally, drawn from another survey, but asked the same question, just about well-being. Whether experiences of frequent job-related stress, whether they were experiencing burnout, symptoms of depression, how well they were coping with their job-related stress, and their feelings of resilience. And what you can see from this chart is that 85% of principals are reporting frequent job-related stress. Just under half are reporting feelings of burnout. Just under a third symptoms of depression, about 20% not coping well. The good news is that about 2/3 of principals are reporting resilience, so that's probably why they've stuck it out during the pandemic. Not shown on this chart, but relevant because of the way the principalship has kind of shifted and more women have entered the field as compared with 20 years ago. Female principals were more likely to report frequent job-related stress and burnout compared with male principals. I should emphasize that the findings from the winter of 2022 are consistent with what was found the prior year, January 2021, with regard to principal reports of job-related stress. This is good news in a sense, as it suggests that it hasn't gotten much worse with the additional year of the pandemic. But obviously, this is still something of potential concern. Now, on this slide, I'm showing responses from teachers, principals, and working adults about a different survey question which asked about intentions to leave their job, okay? So we've just talked about how principals as well as teachers are feeling stressed out, but what are they saying about their desire to remain on the job? What this chart shows is that over a third of principals surveyed in the winter of 2022 reported being likely to leave their job. Now, in this chart as well, the principals' responses are displayed in the blue bars in the middle of each cluster. With this chart, the striped segments at the bottom show respondents who reported they were likely to leave their jobs both before the pandemic and now. The solid segment of the bar reports the proportion who reported that they were likely to leave their position now, but they weren't likely to do so prior to the pandemic. So the fact that just over a third of principals reported that they're likely to leave their job now, and the shaded part of the bar is small, only 7%. Only 7% of those principals reported that they were likely to leave prior to the pandemic. That means that the 27% reflected in the solid blue bar are people who said, it's only since the pandemic started that I've started thinking about leaving my job. So this gives us a sense of how pandemic-related pressures may be driving people to consider leaving their role as principals. I'll also mention that these reports, this 34% figure, is up from January 2021, when only 15% of principals using the same question said that they intended to leave their job. So in the second and third sets of bars, we can compare the responses of white principals with principals of color. I included this mainly because of the difference in the teacher bars. With principals, we actually don't see much of a difference in terms of intention to leave their role between white principals and principals of color. But for teachers, the intentions to leave among teachers of color were actually 10 percentage points higher than for white teachers. Okay, so an analysis of the survey data found that certain working conditions were associated with worse self-reported well-being on the part of principals. So principals who reported harassment over COVID-19 protocols, exposure to school violence, experiences of racial discrimination at school, or harassment regarding school policies on teaching about race were more likely to report feelings of burnout, frequent job-related stress, depression, not coping well, and lack of resilience. Basically, all of the well-being indicators that I described on an earlier slide. In addition, principals who reported working more than 60 hours a week or earning a salary of less than $100,000 a year were more likely to report frequent job-related stress, but not the other indicators that we meant, the other well-being indicators that we mentioned. One working condition was associated with better well-being on the part of principals, and that is active involvement in district decision-making. In addition, principals who reported access to mental health supports were less likely to report not coping well, and less likely to report a lack of resilience. So this gives us a peek at some of the things that can contribute to the poor well-being and some of the things that may ameliorate it. Now, this is important because well-being and working conditions in turn were associated with intentions to leave the principalship before the end of the year. Principals who reported poor well-being and certain working conditions, notably harassment over the COVID-19 protocols, exposure to school violence, or experiences of racial discrimination at school, were more likely to report an intention to leave the principalship. And again, principals who reported active involvement in district decision-making were less likely to report an intention to leave the role. It's worth noting that almost 60% of principals reported experiences of hostility or aggression regarding COVID-19 policies, and nearly 30% reported hostility or aggression relating to school policies for teaching about race, racism, or bias. And the survey asked what the source of the harassment was, if it was experienced, and students, family members, and individuals outside of the school community were the most common source of harassment about politicized topics. And I wanted to spend a little bit of time unpacking that and sharing that information with you, because as we think about what we can do to improve the working conditions for principals, I think it's important for both those who are preparing principals and those who are employing principals to be aware of these factors that are causing principals a lot of stress and intention to leave, even if there's nothing that they can directly do about it. Perhaps more of an emphasis can be placed on giving principals the tools to deal with those stressors. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in the rest of the presentation. Another thing that I want to emphasize is that principals were more likely to report experiencing hostility over these politicized topics than teachers in the survey. And this suggests that principals may be taking the heat on these issues and buffering teachers from them. One of the working conditions that the survey asked about was experiences of racial harassment or discrimination. 48% of principals of color experienced racial discrimination at school. And again, for principals, most of this discrimination came from family members of students. Okay, so that just kind of sums up the lay of the land, the overview of what we know in a nutshell about principal turnover and the factors that may be driving it. And what I hope you come away with is a sense that despite significant stressors, there's no evidence that educator turnover was actually higher during the pandemic. Although surveys this winter suggest that up to a third of principals were thinking about leaving their role, intentions to leave are an imperfect predictor of whether someone actually resigns. So my colleagues at RAND estimated principal turnover between fall of 2020 and fall of 21 at roughly 14%. That figure's actually a bit below pre-pandemic trends. And they linked their rough estimates to survey responses about intentions to leave from a survey that was done in 2020. And what they found is that about 19% of them, the principals who said they intended to leave their jobs, actually left. In contrast, about 12% of those who did not intend to leave did so. And that difference between the 19% and the 12% was not statistically significant. On the one hand, we have to take intentions to leave seriously as an indicator that people may be dissatisfied, but it won't directly translate into all of those people leaving. And by the same token, some people who don't have an intent to leave may in fact leave. I've seen a few studies analyzing data from specific states, districts, or metropolitan areas looking at principal turnover during the pandemic. And all of those studies are consistent with what I've just talked about. If anything, principals have stayed the course. They've been committed to their school. Retention has actually been a bit lower during the pandemic. That could lead to a rebound effect as people who were holding off on retirement because they were dedicated to their schools finally take that retirement. It's hard to predict the future. But in sum, what I would say is that while the turnover data do not yet provide evidence that we are in a crisis, there is reason to be concerned that principal turnover in coming years, could tick up, and we need to be prepared to address it. So that directs me to the next section of my talk. What can districts and others do to manage a turnover wave if it comes? How can we ensure that there are good people to fill the gaps? So over the last 10 years, I've been very fortunate to have an opportunity to conduct research on efforts supported by the Wallace Foundation, testing different strategies for improving principal quality through a system-wide focus on principal pipelines. A key insight from that work is just how complex principal preparation and support is and what it takes to do it well. So often when people think about principal preparation, what they have in mind is a program that aspiring leaders attend before they get their first job. I mean, maybe they go away, they come to the University of Georgia, and they're not in your school district even, and then they come back and they're ready to be a principal. But what we've learned through our research is that there's a lot that goes into the making of an effective principal. And this chart describes a general pathway to the principal that we distilled based on our research, looking at in-depth at 7 states, including Georgia. And on the next slide, I'm going to show, and I hope this isn't too out of date, it's from 2019, but this diagram basically populates the prior diagram with Georgia-specific information. And what the diagram is meant to convey is that the system is complicated and there are a lot of opportunities to influence that pathway and a lot of opportunities for different stakeholders to influence it. So all states have a principal licensure requirement. And some, like Georgia, have different stages of licensure for assistant principals and for principals. Like Georgia, many states offer alternative pathways or routes to the principalship that allow people under certain conditions to bypass preparation programs entirely. And like Georgia, most states have expectations for continuous learning of some sort once principals are on the job. And efforts all along this pathway are needed to ensure a strong pool of principal candidates and to keep good principals on the job once they're there. Planning ahead for transitions and focusing on principal preparation can improve the candidate pool. Professional development can further improve the quality of leadership once people are already on the job. And what about the retention of current principals? That's also important. The RAND survey asked principals who had expressed an intent to leave what was driving them potentially out of their role. In terms of what was driving them out of the role, the top two responses were, number one, the fact that the stress and disappointments of the job were not worth it. And you can say, well, what does not worth it mean? Could have something to do with pay and other factors. Second thing, that they had too many other duties, leaving little time for instructional leadership. The most frequently mentioned things that principals said would make them stay were, first, a set of things that would make the job more doable and satisfying, fewer hours per week. 34% of principals reported that they work more than 60 hours a week. Okay? So fewer hours per week would help. More staff and the ability to spend more time on instructional leadership. Second thing they mentioned, more pay. 40% of principals said this, and it's interesting, on the survey, 37% of principals reported that they earn less than $100,000 per year. My colleagues didn't analyze the correlation between those two, but those are some of the things that were mentioned. It's also worth noting, when we talk about support for ongoing professional development, in a way, the call for ongoing professional development also extends to teachers. You know, extending that ongoing professional development for teachers to ensure that they become teacher leaders helps build that pipeline to the principalship, and make sure we have people who are ready to enter the preparation programs and do a great job once they get through them. Okay, now I want to turn and discuss some lessons learned from a decade of research on principal pipeline systems about what districts, states, and prep programs can do to build and enhance these pipelines. And I'll start with some insights from the Principal Pipeline Initiative, or PPI for short. So the Wallace Foundation launched the PPI in 2011, and the concept built on a base of existing research at the time demonstrating that principals matter, and on what makes for an effective principal, as well as better ways to prepare, evaluate, and support principals. And the PPI included 6 large school districts, shown here, including Gwinnett County Public Schools, right here in Georgia. Collectively, these districts serve nearly 2 million students. The Wallace Foundation launched the initiative back in 2011, and they asked each of the districts to undertake comprehensive efforts to enhance 4 components of a principal pipeline. The components were based on the research mentioned earlier and included efforts to define and set leader standards, put in place high-quality pre-service preparation, engage in selective hiring and placement, and provide on-the-job evaluation and support. Now, this is kind of a thumbnail overview. Each pipeline component encompassed a number of specific activities. But it's important to emphasize that this was a general framework. It was not a specific menu that every district had to follow. Each of the districts in the initiative was coming into the initiative from a different starting point, facing different challenges and capitalizing on different opportunities. And they prioritized specific activities as appropriate within this overarching structure. The main point is that all of the districts focused on these 4 components of the pipeline and did what was needed in their context to improve these components. And the basic idea here is that each of the components are things that school districts do. Some do them well, some don't do them well. But when a district has a principal vacancy, at the end of the day, they have to hire them to fill it. Others, like delivering pre-service training for principals, some activities are things that some districts are doing, but other districts are not doing. And the point of the initiative was to ask districts to focus strategically, to develop a plan for engaging in some set of activities across all 4 of these components, and importantly, to align them with clear leader standards in order to create a cohesive system for their principal pipeline. So in sum, I want to emphasize that the initiative focused on things that districts do to prepare, hire, and support principals, that it asked the districts to think strategically about those things, and that it allowed flexibility for districts to do what they thought was best to address their needs. So RAND and Policy Studies Associates conducted research on the implementation and effects of this initiative, and RAND produced a study documenting the effects of PPI in 2019, which are available for free online to you to read at your leisure, if you're interested. RAND also produced a study documenting the costs associated with implementing principal pipelines in 2017, and in late 2019, we conducted a survey of districts around the country who didn't participate in PPI to assess what those districts were doing and interested in doing related to principal pipelines. And findings from that survey were published in 2020. And so what I'll be sharing in the next few slides are some insights drawn from these 3 reports. So our research on the Principal Pipeline Initiative revealed that principal pipelines are a feasible, affordable, and effective way for large districts to improve schools. Our study found that it is feasible for districts to implement all 4 components of a principal pipeline at scale. These districts did it. The second key finding is that pipelines are affordable. It didn't cost a lot for districts to do this work. We found that pipeline districts spent less than 0.5% of their budgets to operate and enhance their pipelines. That's not the over and above costs of enhancing pipelines during the initiative. It includes spending on business as usual activities that they were already undertaking prior to the initiative. On a cost per student basis, this amounted to roughly $42 per student per year on average. We also found that the principal pipelines are effective. Our study showed that they benefited districts, schools, and students. As shown in this chart, schools in PPI districts that received a new principal outperformed comparison schools by just over 6 percentile points in reading and almost 3 percentile points in mathematics after 3 or more years. That means that a school that received a new principal and whose students would have otherwise been at the median in reading achievement was instead at the 56th percentile. These statistically significant positive effects were widespread in these districts, and they kicked in quickly. They were larger for schools in the lowest quartile of the achievement distribution. And importantly for today's conversation, we also found effects on principal retention. For every 100 newly placed principals, PPI districts had nearly 6 fewer transitions after 2 years and nearly 8 fewer transitions after 3 years. Now, one criticism that we've heard about principal pipelines is that, sure, districts can do this when they get a pile of money from a foundation to do it, but it's not generalizable. And after we released the report, we undertook a survey of districts around the country who had not participated in PPI to get a lay of the land nationally. I mean, just to understand how prevalent is interest in and use of activities that we associate with these pipeline components. We used a structured interview protocol to ask superintendents and other senior district leaders about specific efforts. Our survey, which included districts of all sizes, not just large districts, showed that school leadership figured prominently in district strategic plans, and that the vast majority of districts were engaged in at least some, and often several of these efforts to improve their pipelines. The most commonly reported activities that 2/3 or more of the districts we surveyed were engaging in, were related to leader standards, processes to tap potential school leaders, professional development and support for aspiring principals, standards-aligned evaluation in cases where standards existed in the district, and coaching for all first-year principals. Less common were efforts to engage with preparation programs, using talent pool processes, having a dedicated position overseeing the pipeline, and using data systems to track aspiring leaders, and the use of performance-based hiring techniques. The survey also revealed that districts were not fully satisfied with their principal candidate pool. And they wanted to do more to improve it. 49% of our survey respondents, only 49% reported that they were satisfied or very satisfied, meaning that more than half thought that there was room for improvement. When probed on the gaps in that candidate pool, the interviewees pointed to low numbers of applicants from specific racial and ethnic groups, low numbers of applicants with prior leadership experience, and with specific types of leadership skills. So districts are the ones that hire, evaluate, and provide support to principals on the job, and these are pipeline activities. The research shows that districts can put such pipelines in place, and that districts of all sizes across the country are at least interested in pipeline activities. But they can't do this work alone. So in 2016, partially stemming from the experiences of the Pipeline Initiative, the Wallace Foundation launched the University Principal Preparation Initiative, or UPPI. This initiative targeted preparation programs. It funded university preparation programs to partner with nearby districts and engage with state partners in principal preparation program redesign efforts focused on improving the quality of these programs and ultimately the quality of the aspiring principals that would graduate from them. Preparation programs in 7 states participated in UPPI, as shown here, including the great team from Albany State University here in Georgia. Yep. So principal preparation programs are embedded in a system that supports leadership development. And school districts, state education agencies, and preparation programs all have a role and a stake in principal preparation. So, I keep emphasizing that it's the districts that hire and evaluate principals and provide them with support on the job. And they're the ones that are close to the day-to-day realities facing principals. District officials are in a good position to inform preparation programs and also state officials about the things that principals need to know and be able to do. This type of feedback from districts can and should inform principal preparation programs, licensing requirements, and ongoing professional development requirements. While providing such feedback takes time, districts stand to benefit if preparation, licensing requirements, and ongoing professional development requirements are in fact aligned with the needs of today's schools. And the UPPI experience shows that this kind of collaboration can happen, and it shows what the benefits are when it does. States play a key role by driving coherence across the state through common standards, setting licensure requirements, expectations for preparation programs, and expectations for districts about how they evaluate and support principals. States also provide resources, expertise, and support that can enable districts to implement coherent pipelines. And of course, preparation programs play a key role by providing aspiring leaders with the foundational knowledge that they need to succeed in the principal role. And the UPPI evaluation shows that university programs working in partnership with districts and states can improve those programs to incorporate features of effective principal preparation. And this is important because the district survey that I mentioned earlier showed that districts want to collaborate with preparation programs. I know that there are myths out there about how, oh, the district officials are too busy, they don't want to talk to us. If they think they have a receptive audience on the university side, they'll come to the table. But, you know, they have to feel like their feedback will be acted upon. Under UPPI, the programs collaborated with district partners with the goal of improving the program's principal effectiveness. The districts could see how their input was being incorporated into the programs, and that made it workable. So the UPPI experience indicates that collaboration among district, state, and university representatives can support coherent efforts to make the job doable, expand the readiness of the candidate pool, and improve on-the-job support. Such efforts offer hope of improving the working conditions that principals report are stressing them out and could drive them from the job. And by improving the quality of school leadership could also address some of the challenges that teachers are reporting, maybe driving them from their roles as well. So as we start the fourth pandemic school year, education leaders are understandably worried that the stresses of the pandemic and other social forces are creating a crisis, that they're driving educators out of the workforce. In this talk, I hope I've shared with you some evidence that in the face of these enormous stressors, principals have largely stayed the course. But many are considering leaving their positions. So there's good reason for districts and states to be worried, but not panicked. Principal turnover is a fact of life. It is not something that will ever go away entirely, but there are actions that districts, states, and preparation programs can take to help districts manage this reality. Efforts to build and sustain principal pipeline systems hold real promise for managing principal turnover, not just in response to the current potential crisis, but on a long-term basis. These changes are key to addressing the concerns that principals say are pushing them out the door. And they can ensure that when this inevitable turnover happens, either stemming from this crisis or another one that'll happen a year from now, that districts have a capable principal waiting in the wings to take over. So with that, that's the end of my remarks, and I would be happy to take any questions that you might have.